Hello everyone and welcome back to my latest video. In today's video, we are going to taking a look on how to implement OpenID Connect with Keycloak, and I'm going to show you several options how to integrate this. Please keep in mind some of these things are just for the sake of the demo. You might do some things in a different way in production. Okay, then let's dive in. So what we need here is our so-called Example Konstruktion KIT. There is a video on YouTube, Kubernetes by example, which will help you to set this up. It's also possible to have Keycloak running in Docker. There are a lot of tutorials on the internet to keep you up and running, but for the other options I will show later, it's important that we use the Example Konstruktion KIT. You should use the latest version because earlier versions had some bugs here. So what we need to do is actually we go into Helm, Templates, Infra, and then to 7 add-ons, OIDC, and then we say stack init. So this will basically bring up Keycloak and some other stuff that we will take a look at later. So if we go to our welcome page here, we can click Keycloak and then we go to the administration console and we will be greeted by Keycloak. So what is important to know that OpenID Connect is a standard that was previously called OAuth 2, and a lot of people address this as single sign-on because it's possible to connect multiple applications with the same login. And Keycloak is one possible implementation of OpenID Connect. It is not the only one. It is the most popular, but there are other implementations, for example, like OAuth 0 and other stuff. So if we logged in with a super secret password admin, we will be greeted with our admin console here. So what we need to do first is to create so-called realms. So the way Keycloak organizes its structure internally are realms. What we need to do is here add realm, and we now have the options to create the realms manually, but this is already prepared. There is a subfolder realm config here under Keycloak realm config, and you can just import tenant 0. And then we say add realm tenant 5. So basically, this is just a way to organize and separate things. This is somehow the equivalent of namespaces we have in Kubernetes, for example, and we are using this to separate our customers, because in this video, I'm also going to show you how to implement multi-tenancy with Keycloak, or at least one option. So now, as we see here, we now have a master realm, a tenant 0, and a tenant 5. We go to the tenant 0. What else have we got? We also have clients. This is important. So we have a client for our callee service and for our person service. And we have roles. We have so-called standard role. You can create all of this manually, but it's prepared here. So if you take a closer look at the client, if you create a new client, you will be asked some questions, and you see the access type is public. You usually don't want this in production. So in production, you would usually say confidential, then save this. We can do this now. And then that's a little bit confusing. You get a additional tab then here, which is credential, where you can create additional credentials for additional type of authentications. But for the sake of the demo, we currently stick with public because it makes things a little bit easier. So these are our clients, and it is important to know that all of these things are separated between the namespaces. So we have clients, we have roles. What else have we got? Of course, we need users. Users cannot be imported or exported by Keycloak for obvious security reasons. So we now have to create our user. In our tenant 0, We just add a new user and we give it the awesome name user0. And it's also important to give this an email address. We just say user0, user0, otherwise we will get problems later. We can save this guy here. And then what we will also do is what you usually also would not do is to give this a password. Usually, if the user would log in the first time, it will be greeted with a window and ask, please enter your password. So we will now enter the password up front and save the password. Yes. And what we will also do is we add a role to the user. So there is only one role, obviously, which is standard. It's important to stress the difference between authentication and authorization here. So what we did before the roles is authenticating the user, having a username and a password, and we now add authorization, which basically is what is the user allowed to. So authentication only takes care that the user can log in. The authorization will then tell the user is allowed to call this and this and this method. Okay, so 10 and 0 is set up. And then we go to 10 and 5 and repeat the same procedure somehow. Here we now add a different user. We call it user 5. User 5 at user 5. We again add a credential. Oh, there was a typo. So of course, Keycloak checks it. And we add a mapping, a role mapping. Okay, that's it. We are all set up. We can close the window. Now we can make a very simple test here. So in the example construction kit, there is currently this OIDC MD. And you can just, for testing things, copy this thing here. And if everything works, this should give you a very long string here. So what it's actually doing? So this is actually doing a post request against our OpenID Connect endpoint in Keycloak and asking for a token. So it logs in with our user0, and the secret password user0. It gives a client ID, the client we created earlier in Keycloak. And then this returns a so-called token. And this is basically one of the possibilities we can now use to authenticate against our Keycloak just by logging in and retrieving this so-called JWT token. If we want for later applications, we can then just call our application and hand over the token via the so-called bearer access token, but we will see this later. So this will indicate that everything is running. So we are finished with our initial setup. Then let's continue with our first option, how to implement this. And our first option will be Quarkus. So for this, we are using our trustworthy Corley service Quarkus here. It is important that in the application properties, security authentication enabled is set to true. And now we can bring up our application. We say run. Application starts on localhost this, and then we open a new incognito window here, because otherwise the client might already have, the browser might already have cached that we are logged in. We get the welcome page, nothing special here, and then we call the method. And now you see that we will be greeted with a login account. So this is obviously our tenant 0, and then we can log in with user 0. And it works. The method gets called, and we can call other methods. And everything works perfectly fine. So how does this work? Honestly, with Quarkus, it's very simple. So you basically need one dependency here, which is Quarkus OIDC. You need to set up some things in your application properties, which is basically everything here with Quarkus OIDC. But it's important to know the properties. So we say here application type hybrid. There is also web app or service, but with hybrid, you have two options. So what we just saw with the login window is the so-called authorization code flow. This is if you want to log in from a front end, and there is also the bearer token authentication we will see later. And with hybrid, you can just do both. Access token, we have to set our client ID, and of course, we have to tell the application where our Keycloak is running. You see here that our Keycloak is running in Kubernetes, but in Kubernetes, this is also exposed via a so-called service. So I'm not using the reverse proxy here. I'm using a direct link here because the reverse proxy link, at least for me, did not work when I try to work with my development application against something in Kubernetes, which you would never do in production. Okay, and that's it, and it works really, really good in Quarkus. This is basically all you have to do, and it takes care of everything. And it's also important, again, to stress that this implementation is OpenID Connect. So Quarkus does not know that there is a Keycloak on the other side. So in theory, you can just swap out Keycloak with something else like OAuth 0 or something else that can also do OpenID Connect. Okay, this is the simplest example. So let's take a look at a more complicated example. I will bring up my application again. And now we take a look at the person service Quarkus. The person service, as you might know, is a more complete application which also communicates with the database and is able to access other applications. So the person service for communicating with the database also needs to have multi-tenancy enabled so that we can use multiple users, customers with the same application. So let's take a look at this. What does it mean? This is our person service, looks pretty similar to the call it service. So again, if we do a call here, we have to log in and we are authenticated, and subsequent calls will just work. What is of course important, if we now go to our call it service, this is on this port here, we should already be authenticated. Okay, this takes a while and it works. Okay, the thing is now, the call it service only worked with a single tenant. If you remember in the auth URL, we had already tenant 0 here. If we have a multi-tenant application, it should be possible to switch the tenant. We are doing this here in the person service by having an HTTP header. There are other, maybe better options, but this is an easy option. So currently we are working with tenant 0, and now I will switch to tenant 5. So what will happen if I call a method? I have to relog in. Why is that? Because I'm only authenticated against tenant 0. Now I switch to tenant 5, and it is of uttermost importance that I have to relog in. So I log in here. I say user 0. This will not work because user 0 is not known to tenant 5. So we have to log in to user 5 here. And it works. There is no data because this tenant has no data, but we are authenticated. And now if we switch back, also important, to tenant 0, yeah, we get, if you get back, you get some error logins, but we are still logged in and it works. So of course, I don't want to relog in now because now I am authenticated against 0 and 5 and it just works. And this is the expected behavior. Okay, what we can also do here is we can call another method. So this is the person service called callee service, and it just works. But that's you have to do something for this, because if you remember, our person service and our callee service are also using OpenID Connect, and there is also authentication activated. This kind of authentication between services is the so-called bearer token authentication. This is what we saw here. So we can try this again on our console. I get the JWT token. Now, if I, for example, call my callee service from the console, this should not work because it tells me, please log in. This is this 3.02. And now I will pass in my bearer token, which I got earlier. And it again takes a while. And then you see the call gets completed. Your name is Heisenberg. It takes a while. From my experience, a local application communicating with the Keycloak in Kubernetes has some latency. But again, this is nothing you will do in production, because in production, you will always have your application inside Kubernetes and your Keycloak. So this is just for development. Okay, this works. So how can we achieve this with our application? So what do we have to do? So we have this adapter class here. And if this adapter class, which is, so if we do say my name on the front-end side, it will call the so-called callee service adapter, say my name, and the callee service adapter will then call the callee service. But of course, the bearer token has to be handed over. And Quarkus already got us covered. What we only need to do is to say register provider, configure access token request filter class. And this is a class that extends this access token request filter. And oh, by the way, you can find all the source code on callee service and person service on the branch OIDC. And that's basically it. What we also need to do is to forward our tenant, so that if the person service connects to the callee service, that it knows which tenant have we called. And this will automatically forward the bearer token, so that authentication between the backends will just work. This, again, these are two different things. So authentication from the login is a so-called authorization code flow. And then you can additionally have authentication between your backend applications. You can, but you don't have to. That's your decision. Okay, that's basically for Quarkus. So next option is Spring. So can we achieve similar things with Spring? From my experience, the Quarkus implementation is very good. Let's take a look what we can do in Spring. So I think I have to stop my applications here. Otherwise, I will run into some trouble later. So for Spring, we need our callee service, not callee service Quarkus, of course, the normal callee service, and Keycloak. I will show you now a little bit more condensed, because in contrast to the callee service Quarkus, this can also already do multi-tenancy. So how does this work? We start our application. This is now the Spring application. I shut down everything here and say, and again, we will be greeted with our login page. And it works. So how does it work? For Spring, we are using the so-called Keycloak Spring Boot Starter on the branch Keycloak, by the way. And that's the first difference. In contrast to Quarkus, where we just know about OIDC, Spring now knows exactly that there is a Keycloak on the other side. So it's not possible to swap this out with something else. It won't work because we are coupled directly with the implementation, and even it even has some knowledge of the version. So this is the Keycloak Spring Boot Starter for version 15, and it might know that there is a 15 on the other side. So even upgrading to a later version might not work without upgrading the dependency here. What else do we need to do? Very similar. We have our application YAML here. And it's pretty similar. We have to set our client ID, which is called resource here. We say public client true because we remember we have a public client here. We have to set the auth URL, and usually you could also fill the realm. So if you have a single tenant application, you would just have tenant 0 here and will just work. But we have a multi-tenant application here, or at least for this showcase. And for multi-tenancy to work, we need to implement this. So this is a so-called Keycloak Spring Boot config resolver, which basically works this way, that it gets the tenant ID, and then by this constructs the tenant ID on the fly to connect to Keycloak. I forgot to show this in Quarkus, honestly. In Quarkus, we have something very similar. So in Quarkus, this is hidden in the so-called tenant ID interceptor, which basically does the same. It gets the tenant ID from the outside, and then we have this create OIDC config, and it will also create a connection to our Keycloak that contains the realm, because the realm consists basically of the tenant ID given from the outside and a standard string, which is basically a tenant. Okay, set realm. And this way, we also already have multi-tenancy here. So if we bring up our application, we do a method call, we have to log in. The difference, however, and that's not nice, if we change our tenant here to 5, you remember we should have to relog in like in Quarkus. But in Keycloak, it's not working this way. I tried to solve it. I already had a discussion with the people over there from the Keycloak adapter. There is some kind of caching going in the background, and it does not tell us to relog in here. So that's not a good thing, because this means, at least in my demo setup here, if we are already logged in tenant 0, we can access now everything in tenant 5. Please keep in mind, it's a different story if we have a fresh window and I start with tenant 5 in the beginning. It will, of course, tell me to log into tenant 5 because I'm not authenticated. This will work. But again, now swapping back to the other tenant, it will not tell me to relog in, and I was not able to solve this problem here. It's important to know that that multi-tenancy via realms is not the only option. There are other options to do this in Keycloak, for example, but this is a drawback. And there are also some other minor drawbacks with this approach here in Spring. So basically, you can use Spring with Keycloak, but it has the limitation that it's not the OIDC abstraction. You have to know about Keycloak, and it seems that we're currently having a problem with multi-tenancy if multi-tenancy is important. If not, this is one of the most feasible options to be used. There is, however, an alternative. Spring has an implementation of OIDC or OAuth2 as they call it, but this is not working at all, guys. So this works for very basic approaches. You can, for example, log in with Google or other things, but it has a lot of drawbacks and limitations, at least from my experience. So I'm not going to show this approach because, at least from my experience, this is not ready for production, at least not if you want to use something like Keycloak on the other side. They may and should fix this in the future, but for now, your best option is to use the Keycloak adapter, which most of the people do. Okay, so that's it for part 2. So for our last option, we take a look how to integrate OpenID Connect without actually implementing it. So what does it mean? We can have an option that we don't need to change a single line of code and just have it via a configuration inside Kubernetes. So if we brought up our OIDC stack as before, and we take a look at the OIDC namespace, we see here that we not only have Keycloak and Postgres database, we also have these proxies. And these proxies help us to get OpenID Connect running without changing a single line of code. So what we need to do is we need to bring up our application. Here it's in example Quarkus, and then I go to tenant 0. The tenant idea, don't get confused. This application can also work multi-tenant. And then we need to change our ingress before bringing it up. So basically, the ingress is inside Kubernetes is that everything that comes from the front end gets routed through the ingress and then back to the pod of the application. And this is a perfectly good spot where to put security. This also handles the server certificate for HTTPS. And usually in the standard configuration, you just have basic authentication here enabled, at least in my example. So what we need to do, we need to change this. And I might change this in the future that this can be configured via Helm. But currently you just have to uncomment these lines and comment in these lines, which will replace the basic authentication with a sign-in process against the proxy. We have to do this for the callee service and then also for the person service. And we can bring everything up. And if everything up, it's already running on my side. Your incognito window. And now I want to open my person service here. And as we see, we are again greeted by a login screen. It is important to know that this is not implemented as part of my application, but this is part of the proxy we now configured before. So we can log in. It works. And if we remember, if we want to change the tenant, we still need to have to relog in. And as you see, it works. We change the tenant and we just can relog in. Second thing, if we now open the callee service, there should be no need to log in because this is why we are having single sign-on OpenID Connect for. We are already logged in. The browser has a cookie set here, and we don't need to relog in the other application. So this works. So how does this actually work? So we have this endpoint, OAuth2.0, which is basically the tenant ID. And we can now log in into Keycloak if we want. And we have this also for the other tenant. And how does this actually work? So basically, it's like this, that inside our deployments, we also have this OAuth2 proxy. And this OAuth2 proxy gets connected via the ingress configuration. This OAuth2 proxy has a configuration, and the configuration is also basically just how to connect to the Keycloak application, plus that it contains the tenant ID, which is replaced here. Unfortunately, the OAuth2 proxy is not capable of doing multi-tenancy. So this is what I'm doing here. I just deploy the proxy multiple times to somehow get multi-tenancy. That's not the nicest option, but it works. And from a memory perspective, that's not a big hit, because we take a look again at our dashboard, we see that the proxy only consumes a couple of bytes of megabyte. So not a big deal. But of course, from a declaration point, you see this is where this takes place. So the tenant ID is basically an HTTP header, and we tell now the ingress reverse proxy to handle this via this variable. So maybe not the best option. If you don't need multi-tenancy, or you have a better solution, you can just have the tenant or the endpoint here and get rid of the variable. But other than that, I think that's a very nice solution. So just having it via configuration, we get OIDC here. The only downside is that your downstream application, as we call it, is not aware of the username. So if you need the username for auditing, for example, or for something else, it's at first sight hidden from the application. It's possible to pass the username to the downstream, but it's not in my example. So that's it for today. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.